For this lecture, we're going to talk about the 1850s and the lead up or several causes of the coming Civil War. I've just kind of called this 1850s a decade of division. When we left off in my last lecture, we had talked about the Compromise of 1850 and how, for a brief moment, the debate over the expansion of slavery was solved by this multi-part compromise that included popular sovereignty in some areas of the Mexican section, a stricter fugitive slave law to appease the South and the issue of runaway slaves, abolishing the slave trade in the capital because that was unseemly and looked bad for our country to be trading slaves right in our capital. And finally, California being admitted to the Union as a free state. The Compromise of 1850, though, was a short-lived compromise because almost all of those things that I just listed are going to just fan into further conflict in the 1850s. It doesn't really solve anything on a long-term basis. For this lecture, I'm going to march through several key events and key terms from chapters 18 and 19 in your textbook. The pictures that I have up here are from your textbook or from the textbook PowerPoint. So I'm just going to show you pictures and try to talk about those issues. The Compromise of 1850, again, this guy here in the middle, this is Henry Clay. You see some of the other famous senators there. Here's John C. Calhoun in the back. Here's Daniel Webster down here. The Compromise of 1850 is really the last heyday of this second generation of American political leaders. And one of the things you see in the 1850s is a new group of politicians, maybe a third generation, start trying to lead America and really solve this slave controversy, this slavery controversy. Some of the new congressmen are people or political leaders are Abraham Lincoln, William Seward, and John C. Fremont and people like that. So you've got a new political class going to come in after the Compromise of 1850 and see if they can lead America. They're not going to be successful in that they get to a civil war. They will be successful in the sense that after the Civil War, the slave question will be answered. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. This is Harriet Tubman over here. The South wanted the federal government to protect slavery and especially the issue of runaways. They said constitutionally the U.S. government had to return runaway slaves. Of course, Harriet Tubman and the activities of the Underground Railroad really fight against that stricter fugitive slave law, helping slaves escape from the South into free territories in the North. Northern anti-slavery governments also assisted the Underground Railroad by passing what were called personal liberty laws, which were meant to kind of counteract the fugitive slave law that basically said, in our state, if you set foot on our soil, you are free. And that state law triumphs over another state law. So it was kind of an interesting, the personal liberty laws were a reaction to the fugitive slave laws and tried to kind of trump the states' rights argument, but with the freedom side. So that's an interesting development in the 1850s. Something else that happened in 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is an anti-slavery book. It's not necessarily a literary masterpiece from what I understand. I haven't read it, but in the excerpts I've seen, it's very wordy and melodramatic. But what this book does is it really highlights the moral evil of slavery, and it humanizes the destructive actions of slaveholding and specifically the selling of slaves down the river. This book got wide readership, and you see some of the numbers on this picture. It got international fame, and so it kind of spread the anti-slavery message around the world. And this was very, I think your textbook calls it incendiary. It means it inflamed the passions of the people. These are just a few things. The Underground Railroad, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the stricter fugitive slave law, the personal liberty laws that are really highlighting the division that's going to come in the 1850s. But now we'll get to the centerpiece, and this is leading up to what's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In the early 1850s, under the Pierce administration, Southern interest worked to purchase this piece of land here, known as the Gadsden Purchase, 1853. And the idea was that this would eventually be a southern route of what's called the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a good path because it goes underneath the Rocky Mountains. It's got better terrain. And this was to be seen as a big victory to strengthen the southern states, strengthen the southern economy, and essentially ensure the perpetuation of slavery. However, this guy, Stephen Douglas, he is a new leader, one of that third generation of American political leaders. He's from the state of Illinois, and he wants the Transcontinental Railroad to run through his home state, Illinois, and kind of port in Chicago. So, for example, just to go back to this, instead of the southern route running along, or the Transcontinental Railroad running along this route, he wants it to run from up here, about San Francisco, straight across the middle of the country and reaching over to Illinois and locking in, instead of in the Gulf, in the Great Lakes. To do this, he needs to open up Kansas and Nebraska to settlement. And in an effort to secure a northern route for the Transcontinental Railroad, he takes two areas, Kansas and Nebraska, that should have been free territories under the Louisiana Purchase. He's going to throw out this idea of the Missouri Compromise, and he says, let's open Kansas and Nebraska up to popular sovereignty and just let the residents of those territories decide whether they will have free governments or a slaveholding government. The problem with this is that because Kansas and Nebraska were just territories, resident status was fluctuating. And when they go to have a vote to let popular sovereignty, let the people vote on whether it would be a slave territory or a free territory, both interest groups flood the region with voters. So pro-slavery advocates from Missouri jump the border, kind of head over into Kansas, and they're going to stack the vote for the slave interest. At the same time, a group of anti-slavery advocates called the New England Immigrant Aid Company, they sent people into these territories to stack the vote for the anti-slavery view. What ends up happening is elections that can't be trusted, illegal elections, fraudulent elections. Later on, instead of popular sovereignty, Abraham Lincoln will refer to this policy as squatter sovereignty, because he's like, people were just moving in and squatting and demanding their way. Kansas, when it applies for statehood, will actually have two constitutions. There will be what's called the Lecompton Constitution, which was the petition for statehood based on slavery, and the Topeka Constitution, which was based on anti-slavery, on freedom. Either way, people don't trust the elections, they don't trust the vote, and civil war breaks out in Kansas in the 1850s, well before the actual Civil War in 1861. The fighting that ensues is referred to as Bleeding Kansas because it is property is destroyed, lives are lost, there's radical violence. This guy, John Brown, he is a radical, violent abolitionist. He's on the anti-slavery side. He wants to completely remove the slave interest from Kansas. Him and his sons actually famously hacked to death 5 slave owners with broadswords by a creek in Kansas, and eventually he escapes to Canada. He will come back in the next lecture, but he is a radical, violent abolitionist who fought during the Bleeding Kansas affair. Uh, Something else that happens that just kind of highlights the division is what's called the Brooks-Sumner affair. Um, Charles Sumner, he's this guy down here on the ground who's kind of been beaten and is getting bloodied. He wrote an argument, or he wrote a speech that was called "The Crimes Against Kansas," and he basically accused the South of manipulating the Kansas situation for the slave cause, and he insults this guy named Andrew Butler, who's also a congressman. Preston Brooks, who is related to Butler, marches in to the Senate floor, and he beat Charles Sumner within an inch of his life with his cane on the Senate floor. You can see the other Southern congressmen are smiling as this is happening. Literally, Charles Sumner he had brain injuries. He had to kind of resign temporarily from the Senate. He had to go to Europe to recover. He does come back in the 1860s, but this was just seen as a debacle. Southern and Northern differing slave opinions literally beating themselves into a bloody mess on the Senate floor. This cartoon is satirizing it, saying this is Southern chivalry, beating people up on the Senate floor. The author of this cartoon is also the author of a cartoon that you guys are doing for homework about forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. After the kind of debacle in Kansas, and I say after, it's ongoing. The Bleeding Kansas affair will go from about 1854, when the act was first passed, all the way up to the Civil War. And one side effect of the Kansas situation. The Whig Party did not have an answer for that conundrum, and the one party that emerges out of the Kansas-Nebraska debacle is the Republican Party. By 1856, we have a new party specifically formed against the expansion of slavery into Western territories, and that's the Republican Party. In 1857, there's going to be a major Supreme Court case that also highlights division. I'm not going to say much about this because you have an assignment on this, but this is Dred Scott, a slave who was taken into free territory and then eventually petitioned the Supreme Court for his freedom. One thing I will say is between the strict fugitive slave law in Congress, pro-slavery advocates, Pierce and Buchanan, in the presidency, and then the decision of the Supreme Court, it seemed like slavery had kind of locked in support at all three branches of government: the Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court. That is one situation. In 1857-58, it seems like slavery is protected and it is here to stay. And the last thing I'll mention is the Panic of 1857. In the same year that James Buchanan is coming into office, that the Dred Scott decision is being issued, the economy goes into panic. The Panic of 1857 was especially damaging to northern economies. The southern economy, which was largely built on cotton, remained relatively insulated from this panic. This was another way where the South said, hey, look, slavery and the slave system is better than the North because we're not having these financial troubles that you're having. At the same time, the Republican Party, who is emerging out of Kansas, Nebraska, is able to offer solutions to northern states and western states in the form of tariffs and land grants that is building their support around things other than just the anti-slavery issue. So the South feels like this panic is a good thing for them because it shows them as superior. It might actually, in the end, hurt the South because it gave the Republican Party a louder voice and built their support around a multitude of issues. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but that's a lot of things in the 1850s that I think highlight the growing division between North and South. Underground Railroad, fugitive slave law, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott, the Sumner Affair, Panic of 1857. These are all things going on that show growing division. And of course, we're leading up to a civil war in the In my next lecture, I'm going to talk about John Brown, the election of Abraham Lincoln, and really how our country finally broke apart into civil war. Okay. Thanks for listening. Let me know if any of these things you want me to explain further in the Ed Puzzle questions. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.